real digital humans.
Hi, this is Stefan Albert with the Real Digital Humans podcast. And today we have Kevin Alster here from Synthesia, head of the Synthesia Academy. Kevin, welcome.
Thanks, Stefan. It's great to be here.
So I think we've got lots to speak to today about. You've obviously done a whole lot of work around the learning and development space within Synthesia and in your prior life, if I understand right. We've also had a lot of conversations about digital humans, about the real life avatars that Synthesia creates, and how we can create more immersive experiences with that. Let's start with something easy. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up in this role in Synthesia?
Sure thing. So I would go as far back. I've always been interested in emerging tech and how we communicate using different types of technology. So the most interesting and most recent one before Synthesia and looking at AI avatars and the role of synthetic media was in virtual reality. So if you'll remember way back in 2017, so long ago, virtual reality and this idea of a consumer product was taking off where we can start to view experiences and tell stories through virtual reality. And so I became interested in how do we tell stories when you drop somebody into an immersive space? How do you communicate with someone effectively? How do you train someone effectively in a VR scenario or situation? And so that kind of kicked off my love of figuring out how we mediate communication through technology. And in particular, all these things that we start to get more access to as consumers. So with VR, the big thing was you can drop your iPhone into a cardboard and be immersed in a space. Well, now we're in this idea of synthetic media where now we are not just dropping someone into a space, but we're actually talking to digital humans. So just another form of storytelling and learning mediated through technology. And so I happened upon Synthesia as a very serendipitous, where I ended up in Copenhagen, saw what the folks at Synthesia were doing, had a great chance to meet Victor and Steph, and fell in love right away. And now I'm involved in more of the teaching people what is the actual value of AI avatars and what can we actually do with synthetic media. What's the opportunity there, rather than just I think it has this older reputation of deep fakes. So how do we what is the actual value of that? What can you as a consumer make use of that when you use AI avatars?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this deep fake obviously has a lot of negative connotations. Even if you call it deep fake for good, it doesn't really help that much.
Exactly.
I think we're going to just get used to this new world of digital humans or digital, human AIs. And the way I like to see it, for Aisha is, our goal is to sort of humanize AI, humanize automation. AI is incredible. We're able to do so many more things than ever before, but humans can't relate to that. And how do we break down that, or how do we bridge that gap between everything AI is capable of doing, but how we have been, developed over millennia to actually understand and communicate and live happily. And human to human contact is obviously critical there. And I see that being one of the key drivers of the work that I do as well.
Yeah, and I think you're calling on something that is particularly interesting. And it's kind of that big question: what is different about now than ever before? And of course, you can't have a conversation about AI without talking about large language models and tools like ChatGPT. I feel like that's old news at this point, but I think what is important to call out about that is that when we talk about how humans communicate with technology, before you had to learn some sort of programming language, or you had to learn Python or JavaScript or some way to interact with big data or with different programs. And what's great about now is that we're able to use human conversation and the habits of conversation to communicate directly with computers to do many different things. One of which that I'm excited about is, of course, looking at how we communicate, or learning and development has definitely changed with this. The advent of, you can actually have a conversation. You no longer have to learn the language of computers to communicate with them.
Yeah, and this is game changing. And if we also look at, how do we enable access to these kinds of technologies? Some people don't see well, some people don't hear well. a bit of both. You know, if you're getting on a few years in age, and the more forms of communication you can receive, whether it's visual, whether it's audio, the more chances you have of being able to, I think, to put it all together. So I think there's all of these huge benefits, sort of generally. But today we like to specifically focus on this interactive digital human. And I believe at Synthesia, you must be seeing all kinds of amazing use of your technology. So I think for anyone who's out there, they probably know Synthesia. I would probably say it's the most well-known leading form of digital avatars for say deepfake for good, if we for want of a better word, that allows people to create digital twins of themselves, which I've done and presented before, or use some of these standard avatars that look and sound like just real people. So when you go out there and you speak to clients, what are some of the coolest, funkiest things that you're starting to see out there now?
Sure. So I think a lot of, so at a base level, a huge need for folks is this idea of how can we create studio polished video without having to hire, actors and hire a studio. It's now all something that you can do from a browser. That's kind of the base level of what we're seeing. But when you talk about what's the funkiest thing that I've seen, so there's one person I'd love to call out who's big in the world of AI and learning and development is a gentleman by the name of Donald Clark, who is looking at how he can use his digital avatar to start to interact with people. Well, as someone who presents at a lot of conferences, he gets a lot of when it comes to the Q&A, there's a lot of questions that get asked by the audience because they're genuinely curious, questions that he's having to answer 1,000 times over. So really basic questions that are Google, and he's very Googleable, and I'm not sure if that's a verb that we can use, but you could find those questions if you just did a quick Google search on him. So he's interested in using his AI avatar to be able to give something to have people ask his person, rather than, it's a little bit more interactive where they can ask their question to him and he can answer them. I think that's pretty interesting. I think also as far as when you talk about another cool example, I know we'll touch on this later, but thinking about looking at big consulting companies and thinking about how they scale C-suite messaging. So if they're able to create an avatar of themselves, that avatar you can actually automate using an API the information that gets shared out. So let's say there's a big insights meeting and you want the key stakeholders to share out with the rest of the organization kind of what happened and what's important. Well, now you can generate a video with that person's face, delivering just the information that specific region, team, or that specific role needs to know about what happened in this insights meeting. And so again, it's purely generative AI, where it's just taking that raw data and making a video out of it. And so it's really folks just figuring out how to scale themselves. I think that's what I get the most excited about. When I think about my own digital twin or what I use my own avatar for. Something that we haven't been able to do is, I can't speak in Arabic, but something that I use with clients is to prep for a meeting. If folks are somewhere based in EMEA or so, somewhere where I don't speak that language, I can send over, the details for the next meeting or what was covered in their home language. And so we're seeing this as well with other big companies where a popular use case is to essentially clone the CEO. And then let's say you're doing a quarterly address, they can take that same information, have it translated, and then the CEO is then addressing, the entire company in the language of their home choosing. So it's an interesting world that we're seeing. Folks are just starting to play around, but it's essentially, if you could kind of wrap your head around if you didn't have to be on camera, and if you could speak any language in the world, then what would you do with that? And so we're seeing, it's exciting. And so we're seeing companies, they're very much still in the experimental stage, but it's about using your avatar again to scale your presence and whatever that means in your particular context.
It's just so interesting, and it sort of goes, it goes back to, I think, one of our core human traits is we want to tell our story. I'd spent a lot of time speaking to clients and talking about digital humans. And if I did it based on this is the value that it can have for your organization, if I do it based on this is the technology, eyes do glaze over a little bit. And if I say, hey, imagine you could replicate yourself and imagine all the time and energy you would save if you didn't have to be answering those repetitive questions, if you didn't have to be out there going to meetings when you have 3 meetings on at the same time, but you can actually share your message even though you can't physically make it there. Imagine the time and energy you would save. And that seems to just people resonate with that. And you say, well, look, imagine you could do this at a company level. And like, okay, I get it. Like this is AI automation, just like, on steroids.
Yeah, and it's interesting.
And it's human centric.
It's human centered, even as much as just putting a face on it on communication does make a big difference. I mean, it kind of calls to mind if we think about business communications, they've evolved a lot over the past few decades. Where if you think a lot of communication is based on email, that's a text form of communication. Then there's phone, and there's if we think about Zoom and Teams conversations, having synchronous conversation via video. That has found its own way into kind of our an organization's tech stack, and you find different modes of communication. There's a proper fit for the tool for what you're trying to communicate, and like you said, it's thinking about what are the questions you have to answer 1,000 times, or what do you actually need your human self for. There's this interesting divide that I think we haven't had to consider before, which is what would you use your digital self for, and what would you use your human self for? And again, it's we as humans have only so much time to give, and so it's how do you squeeze the most value out of your face-to-face meetings? And I think digital humans kind of backfill all they give us back a lot of time.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question because I've always been asking, what would you want what could you imagine your digital human doing for you? But maybe the right question is, what would you like your physical human to do?
Yes.
And everything else you outsource some way or the other, through automation, through digital humans, through whatever. But the real question should be, what do you want your human self to do? And
Exactly.
that flips the question completely around. And honestly, this is the first time I've really thought about it in those very concrete terms of, we're asking the wrong question.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, my brain goes to a learning and training perspective, just because that's what I'm well versed in, and kind of the opportunity that's opened up for me is, we talk a lot in L&D about moving from the reserving time on people's calendars, having them step away from their desk to attend a training. There's a lot of time that's wasted in in-person meetings and in-person trainings on going over the ground rules, or making sure that everybody has the right information in preparation for a meeting. And this is I think a problem that spans across any industry. Well, you still want that that human touch of communicating that information, but it could be as simple as saying like, hey, this is what we're going to cover. You give the context for the meeting, or you give the context of the training. You kind of flip what you would use that human self for. That human interaction, that face-to-face interaction for. Instead, you can load up your avatar with, not just a one-way bit of communication, but also, if you're able to load up a couple of answers, or you're able to load up your avatar with the right information, people can ask questions before you even have your face-to-face meeting. So again, it's getting into not just a one-way delivery of video, but also starting to think about how do you actually communicate? What communication can you do before you actually have your face-to-face meeting?
And it's really about, once again, efficiency. So if you get everyone in the meeting and then half the people maybe don't fully understand, what they need to bring, what they need to do, why we're having it, who you are, and all of this could be something that could be so easily done in a 5-minute conversation. It feels less like work, I think. A lot of people like to go to meetings, I've seen in the corporate world, because they're too lazy to do work. And if you go to a meeting, it gives you you have a bona fide excuse not to do any work because I'm in a meeting. And luckily, not everyone is like that, but I've certainly seen that out there. And I think it's obviously the wrong approach because it's just the biggest waste of time.
Yes.
And if you can make those meetings smaller and more focused, with all of that pre-work kind of done and understood, that's great. And anything that's a repetitive thing, it becomes quite easy to do.
Exactly.
If you're rolling out a training, if you're rolling out a new methodology, across an organization, you might be implementing lean, I know an example, and you do it by country, office, function, literally repeating yourself every single time. And from my world of consulting, I had many, conversations that were almost identical. So I think there's a lot to be said for automating all of those types of elements of a conversation so that when you actually get there, you can be problem solving with them on the most critical elements.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it just gets back to that idea of, your humans, if let's say you're meeting with a senior stakeholder and, there are questions that you'd like answered, your human self would like answered before, so that you can squeeze the most value out of the meeting. You could actually ask those questions beforehand as your human self and maybe get a sense of the person's personality a little bit before
Mm-hmm.
meeting with that person and meeting in person. So there's a lot that you can do.
Yep. hmm Now you mentioned another, so we're kind of jumping all over the place. That's cool. Let's keep on doing this, and we'll try and wrap it up at the end. But couple other use cases that I've been hearing from in conversations with customers as well as my own thinking is everything around the CEO. So what's the role of a CEO of a company? Normally they're this face that you might see on the news occasionally, you might see in a meeting. If you want to join a company, you almost will never see them unless you're a part of the executive committee.
Mhm.
Um, but how do you actually get to know the personality of the company that you're going to join? And sometimes the best way to do that is to understand the personality of the CEO. So whether it's for onboarding or applying for a job, what are all these different touch points? Whether it's doing the annual update, but allowing everyone to ask the right questions about how things went and get just the bits that they care about instead of listening to maybe a 3-hour Q&A session.
Yes.
I think that would be super exciting for users. And some of it you could, maintain for a long time. Other bits will be for a specific event because a large reorganization of the company. People get told this, then everyone's sort of up in limbo. I don't know if you've been in a large organization where that's happened, and then people are not sure what to do. There's Chinese whispers everywhere. No one has the fact base, and this can go on for weeks or months depending on how well that transition has been planned and organized. But with
Yeah.
this, you could actually do that in the weeks beforehand or days beforehand and launch a digital human conversational tool that will be able to the face of the CEO with predefined questions and answers. But you can just go ask anything you want, and if he has a relevant answer, which he probably would do, they can just jump right in. And I think that's super cool to be able to have a conversation, with this person who's deciding your fate in some ways, whether it's who your new, ultimate boss will be if you're joining a company, or who's driving that reorganization. It's nice to get it from the horse's mouth.
Yeah, it brings up an interesting thought, which is, and again, it's going back to that bigger question of what do you use your digital self for, and what do you use your human self for? Because there are obviously situations that will require more of of high touch, regardless of who that person is in the organization. I think it also something to keep in mind is that often this, a CEO might have, there'd actually be, just like there's a comms team around the C-suite, there's actually going to be someone who is in charge of the avatar, because the CEO themselves would not be, they would not be the ones who are inputting the information, setting the rules and the
Definitely not.
governance
Mhm.
around what roles can who has access to what information, what is the messaging that goes out. And so something that I, on my end that has been interesting is, there are select people who have access even to my avatar, and I'm nowhere near the level of a CEO, and so I recognize that the impact of my own messaging is not going to have as much weight, or I won't be in charge of a merger anytime soon. But it is interesting, thinking about one of the it's an exciting world where you get to scale yourself, but there will still be people involved in this process. And a lot of the work that we're doing at Synthesia, and the reason that a lot of enterprise folks work with us, is because we're not just thinking about how these things are generated, but also, what is the who has access to the to your avatar, and who has access to generate videos in your videos, or bots in your likeness. What types of information are allowed to be AI generated? Because something that we're well aware of, and I think this is kind of the when you start to talk to folks who are more serious about generative AI, there's a huge need for a level of moderation, because this is with your likeness, with your voice, comes this idea of
Danger. Yep.
danger, and their credibility. I think that's the legacy that synthetic media is always going to have on its back, is or coming from this place of how do we actually how can we trust that this is the message that's coming out. And so it's an interesting uh, place to be in right now, because a lot of companies are using using avatars more in or digital humans more in an internal context. I think they're excited to show out that they're at this point in the technology that they're using this, so they're very limited in the messaging that they put out. But a lot of it is internal, because whether it's synthetic humans or it's just generative AI tools, uh, with a broader scope, there's a lot of questions around, what types of how can we trust this information, and there's a lot of
Yep.
ways to
Trust,
navigate around that.
ownership. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, this is something which I've seen critical, and so I mean, one of the things we've been doing is looking at how to simplify that whole creation of a digital human conversation. How do
Mm.
you create that AI in the back, but how do you make sure there's always a human in the loop, and that you have clear ownership of who can, yes, you can get a chat GPT, you can ask it to create questions and answers, you can ask it to, be really thoughtful, you can even give it different types of personalities, and it'll do a really good job. But it will get it completely wrong sometimes. So, this idea of just using pure chat GPT, in some, if you don't care about the outcome so much, it's absolutely fine. But anytime, especially if you have someone's digital twin out there, you need to be really careful that it says everything. So we really believe in this human in the loop for every single digital human response, just to be sure. And we've created a whole solution around that, so that you can get it to automatically create all the content that you want, but there's someone who reviews, approves, and we all know, text to voice and text to face, it's great, but it's not perfect.
Mhm.
Especially if you think of jargon, company names, and so on, your people's names, you do need to do that little optimization. So I think having that human in the loop to make sure the message is right, the message is clear, it can't be confused, the voice sounds right, and that the presentation of the digital human is all perfect, gives you a way to be much more believable and trusted than if you have something which is sort of, having these weird, jerky kind of movements, wrong answers, or strange sounds.
Yeah, and you bring up another good point there, which is differentiating between text to speech communication with a digital human versus voice to voice communication with a digital human. And so, just uh, differentiating between the two, one is where you would write your text into the script box, and you can interact with digital humans in that way, where you know. I think there's a degree of accuracy that comes with text communication with a digital human versus voice transcription. I think that
The speech
the
to text.
technology has.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, every level it gets a little bit worse. So if you have speech to text, you lose a little bit of the information in that transcription. Then you have text through to the AI. Does it actually find the right intent, what you're looking for. Then you have the answer back to the sound, and is that sound correct? And then you have the sound to the face, and are those expressions relevant and correct for that particular? So there's lots of different steps across this process, and it's and the more steps you have, the more chances you have for imperfections along the way.
And to
Definitely.
that point, there's still a lot of growing pains that go into the technology. I think as we get farther and
Mhm.
farther away from, as we get farther down as we increase the complexity of the tech that's involved, I think it's growing pains, but people have to adjust their expectations about what this technology can actually do. I think in its current stage, it's very good for, there's still very much a human in the loop, because there's a lot of business acronyms that are used in internal comms. There's a lot of if you're thinking about localization and pronunciation of language and of other languages, yeah. I think it helps to understand that the tech that and the data that this is based off. There's huge data sets, more so around English conversations, and the input data there that comes from analyzing and understanding what goes into English speech is going to be different from maybe French or Thai, where there's less input. And so, the technology is getting better and better, exponentially, as we've seen this year. Calling out folks like 11 Labs, where the voices are fantastic, but also knowing that I think it's important at this stage to be able to kind of visualize what you have in mind that you want the digital human to do, and then actually experimenting with that to get a sense of reality. Because I think I know, as a somebody who's enthusiastic about the technology, I can think of all the different ways that I would love my digital human to represent me. But then actually putting that out into the world, there, like you said, there's still very much need for human input. But that technology is growing extremely fast.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And um, one really interesting use case that I'd love to share with you and get your thoughts on. So I have uh, this great passionate like speaker trainer. So he trains executives. Typically, I guess they're the only ones that can afford him. How to give these great speeches, these how to talk, how to answer complicated questions, how to prepare, how to basically never get it wrong when you're on stage or off stage and you have to present yourself, your company, respond to questions, and so on. Um, but I think he's been doing it for 30 years. I think there's a sense of he wants to give something back, and there's a sense he wants to also, you know, maybe create something which is going to last longer, which is going to be there. I mean, he has his own books and he has other documentation and videos and all of these things, but it's not the same as being able to have him as a trainer. I have a conversation with him, and so
Mm.
we're building this digital human coach, and you'll be able to go have a chat with him. You can ask him any questions, tell him what your issues are, how it would help. Ask him to give you a mini training, and he'll take you through his methodology, with a worked example. Just really at that conversational level, as if you were basically sitting next to him, maybe in a train, and you wanted some help, and he was just like, "Oh yeah, sure, no, here you go." So you can, anyone can basically access all the knowledge of his book, his methodologies, but with his face, with his personality, presenting the whole thing, using that Synthesia digital twin. And I think that's just such an inspiring example, and I can't wait to share it. It'll be out in the next few weeks. Can't wait to share that with you and folks. I think it'd be really cool.
For sure. So, and I think what's interesting about that, and is that I think it clearly demonstrates this the next evolution of how we learn information. So a lot of the learning that takes place in the current stage is a lot through kind of sharing information, giving somebody practice with skills, and then hope. There's a little bit of hope, that an uncertainty that's injected in there, where we hope that somebody will be able to demonstrate proficiency based off their interpretation of the information. But if you think about it, the most the most high quality learning comes from learning from an expert or learning from a slightly more knowledgeable other. And it comes from that interaction. So a lot of it is maybe somebody presents you with information, you respond with what your best interpretation of that information is and how it applies. And then you get feedback from that person who can in the moment
Mm-hmm.
correct you and help you build that skill that you're particularly focusing on. But what this allows you to do with digital humans is in a not quite in the same as a highly expert person in the same room as you, but maybe the next best thing is you're actually able to communicate with a body of information. You're able to communicate with a set of data. And so we have different ways of consuming information now. Whether that's in terms of the length of the information. Maybe you listen to an audio podcast, or you take a
Yep.
micro learning
Mm-hmm.
and you access it on your phone, or perhaps you use something like Blinkist, where you have summaries of key books and resources that everyone in the
Mm-hmm.
business world reads, and you get a summarized set of insights. But you're still interpreting that information. You're still reading it, and you are comparing it to the knowledge that you currently have about the subject. And maybe there's little or no opportunities for practice and feedback, which is what we really know is how humans really develop their skills, or how somebody goes on the road to becoming an expert. And so what this allows you to do is, and you can already see this now if you were to use something like Claude, where you input a bunch of information, you're then able to ask questions, get back answers, but also test your understanding, or have
Mm-hmm.
or say kind of how close am I to becoming an expert. I think this is a bit off of the this is a bit off the digital humans track, but something that is showing a lot of promise is if you're familiar with Duolingo or Khan Academy. These are, for language learning, or they are for teaching sub uh, school subjects. Something that's exciting
Mm-hmm.
there is that you can go through the full process of having somebody teach you the information like they would a classroom teacher. So let's say you're learning a lot about the Declaration of Independence, and I know that that's a very American reference, but we're going to keep going with this for a second. But perhaps you can
Mm-hmm.
learn about what the Declaration of Independence was about, learn about the different articles, but then what large language models allow you to do is, with the information that they have, they can actually assume different roles. So they can switch the role from being a teacher to being John Locke, and you can ask that person information. And so I think that's one of the huge potentials for digital humans is it can be the same program that a person is interacting with, but thinking about what are
Yep.
all the different roles that it can take on, whether it's moving
Yep.
from someone who's facilitating instruction, maybe to somebody who's a senior leader of a project. Maybe if you're being onboarded into a project, you can ask them. There could be a representation of the client where you can kind of assess, hey, I have an idea based off the mental model and the data that we have programmed for the client. Is my proposal going to go over with their leadership board? And so it's I think an interesting place to be, where these digital humans will not only be representations of real people, but they can also represent or people on your team, but they could also or you yourself, they could represent someone on your team, but they can also have, we'll be, I imagine a world where you're interacting with digital humans in the spaces in between the face-to-face meetings, to bring it back to our,
Yep.
what would you use your
Mm-hmm.
digital self for, and what would you use your human self for? So there's a lot of, I think this opens up a lot of interesting space. I think a lot of the problems that come with that, though, are also, how do we put in the right information, and how do we make sure that these digital humans really represent what we want them to
Yep.
as they take on these different roles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, become more complex. I really like the way you put that, and maybe one thing I'd add to it is, like, if you break down what is a digital human. Let's say someone wants to create a digital twin of you. What does it need to be able to do? Well, firstly, it should look like you. Okay,
Yes.
that we've got. Then it needs to sound like you. Okay, we've got some great examples of how we can do that now. 11 Labs, for example. 11 Labs, Synthesia, we've got this amazing digital twin capability. Then it needs to talk like you. So it needs to maybe have some background language, how you like to talk, what turns of phrase you like to use, which types of words, more formal, less formal. I think this is actually quite easy these days with ChatGPT and how you set up the conversations. It has to have your knowledge. So this is your, let's say your long-term knowledge. Maybe you've written books on what you know. You have podcasts, you have, all this knowledge you can collect, but it also maybe has short-term knowledge like, hey, Kevin, we spoke 3 weeks ago and this is what you said. And I have that in memory. But then the fifth thing, which I think is the magic, and you've sort of touched upon this, is you have these skills, these incredible skills. Now, these are not the skills that are obviously within a ChatGPT model. Most of them are not. Some of them might be. These are things like, hey, I can listen to you and I can watch you and I can say, hey, you're not using eye contact or using too much eye contact. I can tell you that because I can see you. That's a skill. It's actually not that complicated. You get a few AI guys on it that probably have a solution within a few minutes for you. But it's a separate skill. And then you can say, hey, wait a second. When you speak, you're using 98 words a minute. It's typically seen as a bit fast. Here are the top 10 speakers in the world, and they typically go between 70 and 8 as a maybe stock of it, whatever, something along these lines. And then it says, hey, I love the way that, this conversation's going, but I don't have time to understand everything that you're saying. I need a pause. You need to pause more. So these are all separate skills that you can inject on top of the digital, the core four capabilities of a digital human. I'd say these, becoming the standard. Everything has to have these four. But the fifth point is actually not one point. It's this incredibly large bucket of capabilities and skills that you almost need to train one at a time. And as we are getting better, we're able to add these different elements in, using, however we want to include that, whether it's some kind of LangChain, whether it's some kind of functional based, large language model where you can inject functions and, collect or connect to other solutions. I think the best example is the calculator. You have this, multi-million-dollar LLM model, but it doesn't do math very well. And you can have like a $1 calculator and it'll do a much better job. We need to leverage those simple skills wherever we can, but it doesn't fall out of large language models.
Yeah, and what you're touching on there is something that I'm seeing more and more of, which is the recognition of AI and a subset of that, digital humans, being more of a general purpose technology, meaning something that's available to everyone. And so I think what's interesting about that is I think the technology is that people expect is a little bit far off from this idea of their ability to interpret information. So by that I mean, if we even look at large language models, it's still very much under debate whether or not they even understand what what somebody is inputting, whether actually listening or whether they're just interpreting that data and saying what's the next logical answer versus are they actually listening to what we're saying? So I think what you bring up is super interesting, because then it's not just the text input or the speech input, but then it involves the a digital human having access to your camera, where it's actually watching your eye tracking as well, and it brings up this, I think, larger ideal of AI, how much of it can it actually mimic human intelligence? And I think what's great about the coach idea, the coach idea, especially with Aisha, is that it's focusing on specific skills. So at this point in the technology, it's if you're able, based off the data that you have, it's being able to select what is the digital human actually going to be good at, and knowing that it won't be able to do everything just yet, but as the tech evolves and as we have a better understanding of how to translate kind of this massive big data, whether that's visual data or audio input or text data, how we can translate those into the actual skills, I think that sounds like a big challenge that you're thinking about and you're trying to tackle, and
Mhm.
is every learning and development team's dream come true. But I still think that there's a huge gap between even my understanding of um, how we can tag and how we can analyze and how we can interpret visual information. But there is so much potential for what are those
Mhm.
lower level tasks that an AI can take on. So I think it's an incredibly
Mhm.
cool idea.
Yeah, and I'm super excited. I'm, looking at what Synthesia is already able to do in terms of, so there's the understanding piece, and then there's obviously the creation piece. So you understand emotions, but you also create emotions, and you're getting the micro gestures. They're coming in. My fingers are still crossed for hopefully a day soon where you will be able to automatically inject the right emotion for the right answer. So it's not going to be a standard response, but they will be getting more excited, or they'll be getting a bit more, if it's something, sharing, it's like, hey, you just got fired. It's like,
Yeah.
this is not what you want. If you're going to have to, obviously you're not going to do that, but, there's good messages, there's bad messages, and you want to have the digital human with that emotionally correct response.
It,
And it's
it,
one thing to
yeah.
try and do it all by programming micro gestures, but it'll be so much easier with those micro gestures can be, you can just switch on automatic emotion and it will read the text, it'll do the emotion analysis for you, and it'll adjust, even if it's just a sliding scale between normal, excited and happy, and reserved and uncertain, something like that. And, you could just shift that up and down.
Yeah, the tech has certainly evolved since when I joined Synthesia about a year and a half ago. I think the I've in being seeing how the technology has evolved has made me really appreciate how complex the human performance is. I think what you mentioned there in terms of
Mhm.
tone and delivery and voice, that's one part of the puzzle that needs to be unlocked, where it's like you said, it's matching tone to the message. I think when I first joined, I learned the appreciation that I have now about how text information is interpreted is looking at the context between, or looking at the relationship between one letter to the next and the sound it's expected to make, looking at the word in the context of the sentence and how it's pronounced. And already that's extremely complex, and I'm grateful for the R&D team we have here. But then what you're getting at with the tone, I think that's something where at this point in the technology, you can choose the tone of voice manually. But you're right, if we're expected to have digital humans become really a general purpose technology, on the product side, we really have to do the heavy lifting for people and say, okay, you worry about the message, we'll worry about the performance. And then again, there's also the visual component of that, which is um, when I first saw the tech with Synthesia was really based around text to voice and text to video, and delivery around how do we turn this script into matching what the mouth is supposed to do. And all that
Yeah.
was the first stage, I think, that I saw with Synthesia, where that's incredibly complex, even just to match the corners of your mouth, or what are
Yeah.
your teeth doing, or you'll as I'm
Yeah.
talking about this, I'm very conscious of myself on camera, of how much your tongue sticks out when you're pronouncing certain words. That, I think, Synthesia is something that Synthesia has done really well, and as the tech has grown, it's gone
Absolutely.
more to the
Excellent.
to the
Yeah.
rest of the face, where as I'm talking, your eyebrows kind of move up and down when you speak, or your eyes, even though they blink at the same time, might move separately. So that performance is there's a lot of hard work being done to get that mapped out. Something that I think was also a huge chasm to cross was thinking about when you have a digital human, that digital human doesn't need to take a breath before it starts speaking, but because it can just keep generating the audio, it can just keep delivering what it needs to, and it can speak as long as you need it to. But also, when it's not speaking, you'll notice that your body is also breathing, and so there was a lot of work that was done on how do we synthesize for a digital human, their shoulders moving up and down or their chest moving in and out, because
Yeah.
from a
Hmm.
customer's perspective,
Totally.
they expect to see an Oscar-winning performance, and so that gap is always going to be one to reach more and more towards. And this is us just talking about a kind of from a. If you can't see this the video, I'm motioning from the top of the frame to the bottom. It's kind of from the top of the head to the torso. There's a lot of performance that goes on there, but just to kind of give you a peek behind the scenes of what's coming up next is it's not just about this head-to-head kind of broadcaster TV style performance where we're speaking like two anchors in two separate countries, but more so, how do you synthesize a full-on conversation? What does somebody look like from behind when they're having a conversation? So it's not just a static digital human who's talking to the camera, but more so thinking about, I think the next stage is more like an Apple keynote where maybe they'll walk across the stage or they'll gesture to certain things. And so digital
Yep.
humans are getting more and more to be like like the full-bodied human, but in the current state of the technology. And I'm sure this will age poorly as I'm saying this out loud, but right now the emphasis is on that direct-to-camera address
Yep.
from the mid-torso to the top of your head. But there's a lot that goes in there.
Yeah, and I mean it's already hugely complex. The face, I think, people are able to recognize so many micro gestures of the face, probably more than they can for any other part, but anything, the body or any other picture in the world. I think the face is so critical, and it obviously makes sense to start there. And it makes sense to start in that more 2D front-on picture because it's the easiest and you get that right. But yeah, super exciting to think about what this could look like in true 3D and full body and understanding how people move, and relate to gravity and things that are going to be some exciting times. So now, I mean, we're getting close to the end, and I'd just like to, reflect a little bit. If you go back and you think about, what we talked about, the different use cases, what would be, let's think of three, but let's start with the first one. What would be the first use case? What do you think there's going to be just this massive demand, this massive need in the near future for this digital human to basically roll out to every business or home near you?
Sure. So in order to make this a, a widely general, really a general purpose technology, not just for business but also for personal use, I think what we really need one of the solutions is to really figure out, and a lot of companies have this now, is how do you actually clone your physical self? Where right now you could do this through a webcam with Synthesia, but if we're talking about a full-on digital human, what will that look like for somebody to scan their whole self and provide enough input data to actually
Some
program a
information. Yep.
human performance? And so
Hmm.
I think something to keep in mind with that is, as I've been going through this process myself, whether that's getting cloned in our studio in London or with the webcam itself, you find that all of your I think there's a lot of education that people have to go through around the expectations, because you find that all of your personal qualities are exaggerated a little bit. Where I know that I speak a lot with my eyebrows go up and down a lot, and so that becomes input data that gets put into this avatar. And so uh, it's about capturing that human performance. That's one of the I think the big hurdles to clear as we think about what needs to happen for everyone to do this. Does it happen through your webcam? Are you able to scan your body through your phone? I think that's one major hurdle to cover. I think something that makes
Yep.
me yeah, as far as like a general use case that really excites me, that I think we'll see a lot more of, is um, currently at this point within the tech. If we look at generative AI the use of large language models in business, we're not seeing a lot coming out of big companies just yet, because they're experimenting a lot with all these generative AI tools that are flying around at the moment. But what is where I see the strategic companies investing, these are EYs, these are PwCs, they're throwing hundreds of millions of dollars and billions of dollars really at figuring out how do we build how do we use these large language models in-house, specifically for that data protection and privacy and data governance issue that we were talking about earlier in our conversation, where they want to be able to apply a large language model like ChatGPT uh, to have uh, employees be able to ask questions of internal resources and internal knowledge. Now, where do digital humans plug into that, and why I get most excited is because human beings are made to communicate through conversation. I think it's copywriting is something that I struggle with on a day-to-day basis, whether I'm writing emails or writing on social media, and being able to articulate your thoughts as text is difficult, but it's much more natural to speak with your voice and communicate with information in that way. And where the digital human comes in is you need a skin for what's going to represent your company's internal knowledge. There will have to be uh, a, a person to talk to, and someone that resembles a human. So I think that's one of the biggest use cases that we'll see in 2024 is having a digital human to represent some part of the information and have a way to actually have the average employee, or wherever you are in the organization, be able to communicate using your voice with a video representation of a person. So I think that's the first use case that I'm incredibly excited about, because it opens
Yeah.
up a lot of opportunities for to give everyone access to information, especially if you work in a large
Yeah.
organization. I'm sure you've gone through the pains of,
Mhm.
hey, I'm making this request, and it bounces through 8 different people. Whereas if we set the rules and we set the rules around governance, around access to data, you'll then be able to get the information that you need to get your job done. So that's kind of
Yeah.
the first big
So,
use case that I'm excited about.
no, absolutely super exciting. And I think we're joining there the power of the human face. We're joining the power of large language models. And we're basically making it all a lot more accessible. So people like to communicate with people. They don't communicate with AI, but if we can inject the AI to the human face and all that knowledge and capability, that becomes accessible, even enjoyable for humans to relate to. And I think that's super exciting. Something we're obviously spending a lot of time and energy at iamasia.com. If you want to go have a little chat to our little digital human there, always a good fun experience. And I think on that note, let's call this a day. For all of the new people here, please do like and subscribe and share with your friends. Love to have more people on the channel. And to Kevin, huge thank you. It's been super exciting to have you on board.
This was the Real Digital Humans podcast. Please like, follow, or subscribe to hear more.